Monique, I want to tell you, I have friends who are watching the live stream of this event, and actually, I had to leave for part of yesterday afternoon. I continue to watch, in the back of cabs as we were going along. And a friend of mine just said, the reason we're beating Brexit is because this event is more inspiring and apparently better organized. Yeah. So, hi again, everybody. It's so great to be back again after yesterday. It's extraordinarily inspiring and shocking to the conscience and moving and actionable day that we had, where we saw so much. Today, this morning, to start us off, before we go and touch all of those nerves again, I want to talk with you a little bit about technology. I'm going to split my talk basically into two parts. I'm going to spend the first half just talking about technology in general, because I think many of us in this room aren't technologists, and we wrestle with how to embrace and when to embrace these technologies in our work on the front lines. And then the second half, I'd like to give you a couple more examples of things we can do from space and using some of these advanced technologies, some of the things that we're seeing and the ways in which the humanitarian and human rights sectors are using these technologies today. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about, though, is about the nature of the way we perceive the world, how we see change happening around us. Because it's in the nature, I want to say something about the nature of the questions that and the issues that bring us to this room together, to this hall. What do they share in common? Because so many of us work on different parts of this enormously complicated and interconnected set of issues. So the first thing I want to do this morning is play a little game with you. Now, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you two images on the screen. They're going to flicker like this. They're going to go. Took me a long time to learn how to do that. Okay? And there is one and only one difference between the two images. And when you see it, what I'd like you to do is gently and non-competitively, because we're a community working collaboratively, we've just heard, gently raise your hand so I can count you. And that's the whole game. Okay, have you got that? I guarantee you there's a change between the two images when you see it. And if you've played this game before with me, you're not allowed to play. Just gently raise your hand. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3. There's 1, and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm just going to try and get to 10. 8, 9, and 10. Okay, how many people here honestly saw no difference between those two images? Raise your hands. I'd like you to meet the honest cohort here at the Trust Conference. I don't know what those other people were looking at. No, you always, never trust a guy with a clicker, an Italian guy with a clicker. There should be a rule. But for those of you who didn't see any change between those images, and I want to tell you the first time I was shown this, I didn't see the change either. I would like you to pay attention to this part of the image. And I'd like you to watch as the thing that holds airplanes in the sky disappears in front of your eyeballs over and over and over again. And the question I want to ask you is, why did we miss it? Why didn't any of us see it? And by the way, those of us, the 10 proud members of the 400 people who are here, or whatever the number is, right, only saw it after being told it was there and then being repeatedly exposed to it about 25 times. So don't think you're too great, by the way. This is just exactly like humanity. So why do we miss it? Well, how many people here started by looking at the uniforms of the soldiers? Just raise your hands. Okay, see how many hands go up? How about the tail of the aircraft? See how many hands go up? Now, none of you talk to each other, but you all followed the same strategy. And the reason is that human brains are designed to notice certain kinds of change and to prejudice in the direction of those changes. So we're very good at looking for change where we expect it to occur. We're very good at looking for change that happens at certain speeds and in the foreground and associated with individuals that we see every day. So we're very good, for instance, at seeing change that moves like this. We're very bad at seeing change that moves like this, but we're also really bad at seeing change that moves like this. Those abstract, slow-moving, transformational changes that happen in society. And you know, what's interesting is that many of the challenges we confront in this room are invisible to the eye. They're invisible to daily lived experiences. One of the things that everybody in this room who's working on the front lines does, and does effectively, and you saw so much of it yesterday, is drag it into the light to make the invisible visible. A wonderful thinker about the future, Stuart Brand, said, in our society, the fast-moving trends get all the attention, but it's actually the slow-moving trends that have most of the power. It's the things that are happening in the background. And if we're going to tackle the problem of slavery, we're going to have to take a big, enormous, complex, abstract problem that is happening in the background and bring it into the light, tell stories about it, and use the best tools we have to change it. So, I want to talk a little bit about how technology plays a role in that. And in order to do that, I want to see if I can play a little game with you. Actually, I want to talk about technology generally. Okay. So here's a really, really basic idea about how technology moves. So all of us are familiar with timelines. So in general, in the realm of technology, we see two technology curves. The first one moves like this. It takes technologies, and over long periods of time, they self-compound until they take off and they become radically more powerful. So the first computers we had, were less powerful. The computer that was on the Apollo mission to the moon was far less powerful than the computers every one of you have in your pocket that are powering your cell phone. But at the same time, there's a second curve, and that is the cost per unit of that technology comes way down over time. And that's the curve. The upper curve gets computers solving problems on Jeopardy and quiz shows and things like that, and beating people at chess. The bottom curve gets devices into everybody's hands. And the challenge for all of us is that for most of this period, most of this curve, it seems slow and overhyped. The technology is always coming. When I was a little kid, I watched cartoons where I was told we would have a jetpack when I was an adult. And I'm still waiting for my jetpack. It still hasn't arrived, right? And then a tipping point happens, and suddenly it seems urgent, and suddenly everybody's doing it. And it's really, really hard to figure out when, especially if you run a resource-limited organization working on these incredibly difficult abstract problems, for most people, to figure out when do we get on board. And I can show you a good example of the bottom curve. So let me show you two pictures, okay? Some of you may have seen this before, but I just want to give you a quick example. I'm going to play a little game with you. You may have heard this before, where I'm going to flicker two images on the screen. Do you remember this? Okay, so I want to show you two pictures. Okay, so here's a picture of the election of Pope Benedict in 2005. Here's exactly the same shot of the election of Pope Francis in 2013. Now, let's see, if you squint carefully, you can see that there's a difference between those two, okay? So what was the thing that happened in the middle? Was the iPhone, was the advent of these new devices, and within 10 years, for many of the problems we're trying to solve in this room, it's impossible to think about delivering safety. It's impossible to think about delivering services to hard-to-reach populations without these devices. And they happened like that. And that's the moment when the tipping point happens and all of a sudden, things take off. Well, these technologies we're talking about here are going to come to the sector in the same way. Over the course of the next few years, they're going to take off, and it's going to seem kind of amazing that we ever tried to think about some of these problems without them. And one of the things I wanted to tell you is what happens when you do this is the opportunity arrives to create new kinds of feedback loops. I'll give you an example of this. How many people have ever given blood? Okay, I think many people here have given blood. Okay, do you know what happened after you gave blood? What did you get? Tea and cookies, right? And a pat on the back and a sticker and a feeling of moral superiority to your fellow human beings, which lasted for about an hour. Okay, and maybe a little lightheadedness. The problem is, here's an abstract problem, right? The world needs blood. It's hard, and it doesn't need blood urgently at the moment, it needs it all the time. In Sweden, they were actually facing a problem where they didn't have enough people giving blood. And one of the terrible undercurrents of that problem has to do with social solidarity, whether or not we recognize the other people as being part of our own community who need the blood as our communities are changing as a function of migration. So the folks in Sweden did this really interesting thing. They did nothing else. They didn't change any of the things you get, except that when they asked you to give blood, they also took your mobile phone. Okay? And at the moment that the pint of blood that you gave was used in another person, you got a text. And that's it. It's the entire feedback loop. Right? It was right now, your blood is going into another human being. And what happened to donations? Whew, through the roof. They skyrocketed, right? Because we closed the loop on action. And I think we have barely begun to scratch the surface in the slavery, trafficking, human rights community on creating these kinds of feedback loops. We haven't yet figured out how to create the connections between action and outcome that allow people to understand the mechanics of their contributions. Now, I want to tell you about what happens when we begin to collect all that data. This is a model we use at Planet widely, and we've shared it widely with others to try and talk across the different divisions that we have in our community. What do technologists do, and how do these data services work, and then how do we create value out of them? And we have this model called the 4 Eyes. It's called the 4 Eyes because every layer of this 4-layer cake begins with the letter I, and it has to work for engineers who are some of the most literally minded people imaginable. And so here's how it works. We are living through an information revolution with sensors in our pockets. Those mobile devices are sensors. They tell us where we are, where we're going. They tell us about the world around us. In the air, in space, and all of these other sources of information that are coming on board. And as they grow dramatically, there's so much information that we can't possibly make sense of it. So there's a second revolution that's connected to it, which is about creating insights and pulling insights out of the information, typically by taking data that we take from one place, say from space or from our mobile phones, and comparing it and finding common patterns with other data sets. Now, the thing I want to say to you, for those of you who are working on the front lines, is that the most important thing that you have is your license to operate. It's the trust of all the stakeholders around you that allows you to actually do the work you do on the front lines. The second most valuable thing you have, you might say, is your resources. And here I don't mean just financial resources. I mean the data you have, the ground truth you represent, the actual understanding you have is literally the second most powerful thing you have to contribute, because when commingled with these technologies, they allow us to see patterns that go well beyond the scale of your individual work, to see patterns in the whole. And I'll show you some example of those. But the way we combine them is typically by working with the sector, getting the data assets together, figuring out, using some sophisticated tools to combine them so that we pull out more insight. When those insights are stable enough over time, then we can begin to build new kinds of indicators. And we actually think the world's going to shift from a world of big data to big indicators. Real-time, continuous, like stock tickers. You know, we have a stock ticker for the financial markets, but we don't have a stock ticker for slavery. We don't have a real-time stock ticker for deforestation or for environmental degradation of any kind. But imagine if we did. If we did, and here, in order to do it, you have to bring the academicians and the scientists in. You have to enable them to independently verify that it's true. But once you've done that, continuously replenished with new sources of information, we can see how these systems perform. You could see it yesterday with the anti-sex selling ads, right? You could see the effect of policy over time. And that allows us to build the fourth layer, which are new kinds of instruments. And by instruments, I mean technology, policy, and especially finance instruments that are intended to bend the curve of the indicators that they're measuring. And the reason I think this is important is because over and over again we hear there just isn't enough money. There's just not enough resource. We seem sometimes to feel like there is this wall of suffering that we have to contend with, and we are bringing 19th century tools to 21st century problems. Well, these are the kinds of structures that will allow us to bring more resources from the private sector in, because the private sector's resources need to see responsiveness. They need to see the system change. And this is how these technologies can contribute to that. Okay, so there's a lot more information at the bottom and a lot of value at the top. So I want to just leave you with 3 or 4 quick examples of how these technologies, what we can do with them. So I'm going to give you 4 really quick use cases. One of them is in the Madre de Dios, the Tambopata Natural Reserve in Peru. Here, this is illegal gold mining. And this is some of the most toxic labor that's done by human beings on Earth. The pool that person is sitting in is loaded with mercury. If you put a fish for 30 seconds in that pool, it becomes inedible. And that person works day in and day out under those conditions. And here's what we can see from space, right? There's legal mining. That's actually what legal mining looks like. There was an actual legal mining concession. The mining encampment where the workers work, and there's a little spit of illegal mining down there in the lower right left corner. Well, here's what happens over time, right? Notice that on the upper left corner, where the legal mining is, nothing changes, right? Because they have defined concessions, they have accountability law, and they report great sustainability, perfect ethical compliance with the law. It's just that everybody that works there, after hours, goes out and does this activity and pulls in illegal labor from around the surrounding areas, typically enforced labor. And when this image hit the front page of the largest daily in the newspaper in the country, this specific imagery, the government acted. And they went down and they just stopped all this for no other reason than the fact that they were actually changing the flow of the river and creating a flood risk for people who live downstream. They saw a much larger catastrophe even than this one coming. So we know that being able to see this is the thing that allows people see this all the time. But at the human scale, this doesn't require us to bring in the Coast Guard. But this kind of imagery motivates, especially when they're put together. Okay. Second example I want to give you is, the second thing we can do is about keeping systems healthy. Because we heard a lot, and will continue to hear a lot, about the intersectionality around these issues. That conflict and poverty and poor governance and the absence of the rule of law is the perfect environment in which trafficking, slavery, forced labor, and other things can happen. So in that environment, when we see systems that are healthy, but might have 1 or 2 of those risk factors, how do we keep those systems healthy? So here's an example. What you're looking at here is specialized analysis of the corn crop in Iowa. This is predictive analytics that tells us how much corn is going to grow before the corn is even done growing. Now, that's incredibly valuable to commodities brokers, and what we're doing is taking those technologies and beginning to apply them to smallholder farmers in Kenya, who are often, and many other places in East and West Africa, that are vulnerable to climate-induced shocks and disruptions. And the reason that's important is because there's good new science that's just about to be published that shows the strong correlation between shocks to smallholder farming systems and public health crises in major urban environments. A few years ago, I won't go into the details, but just to give you a quick summary, there was a climate-induced series of shocks and droughts that were exacerbated in the rural countryside. And the following year, there was a huge increase in the incidence of syphilis inside of the largest neighboring city in this particular area. And the reason that's posited is that young women left the farms. They came in and entered the sex trade. That, in turn, lowered the rate at which those services were offered, and their collective bargaining power, which increased decondomization, which created a public health crisis. So you have drought over here, and you have an STD infection that the public health officials are trying to work with at the same time, and they're deeply connected. So if we can use these tools as we are now to help build agricultural microinsurance and credit extension and the rest of these services, we can help people deal with those shocks and disruptions, see them coming, smooth out the curve, and help them ride it out in such a way that we don't create those legacy structures. Now, the third one I want to talk about is about how we amplify advocacy, action, and accountability. And here I want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing with the Rohingya. So this is work, we do a lot of work. Our organization has a huge partnership with, we do a lot of work with Reuters journalists, but we also do a huge amount of work with Human Rights Watch. So I want to show you, this is the largest refugee camp. This is before these 2 encampments had joined, separated by about 90 days. So this is the Kutupalong encampment and day 1. Here it is 90 days later. Okay, so this is 3 months of growth in the world's largest camp back and forth. And all that brown stuff you see around the edges is deforestation. That's people cutting down trees for fuel. So in the process, they're actually changing the floodplain and the flood risk associated with living in that area, because once you take the trees out, you increase the risk of landslides and lots of other things. So actually, what we do is we're going in and continuously monitoring this environment. In fact, actually so much so that we've developed algorithms that allow us to count every tent in the camp. So we can do really good population estimates. We give that data to a bunch of hydrologists who then use it to produce real-time flood risk maps to show us where the most vulnerable people are in the camps, and that information goes to the World Food Program, to BRAC, to many other organizations that are on the very front line of delivering food and other critical services to people who live in the camps. Now, this, as you know, is a huge enforced migration, but what happened on the other side of this, right? What happened after they were forced out of Myanmar was, before I show this, I'll just say one other thing. Once we trained these algorithms to find these camps, we released them on the world, and we found plenty of settlements that are on no map whatsoever. In fact, we have to be very careful about who we release that information to, because we're not always sure people want to be found in these kinds of environments. So I'm going to talk a bit about the ethics in just a second. But here's what our friends at Human Rights, I'm going to go back just for a moment. Here's what our friends at Human Rights Watch did, looking at 30 days across 6 villages in one part of Myanmar in Rakhine State. The government said, when people fled, they left fires burning and everything was burning down, so we had to go down and fix it. So this is what actually happened. So here are these 6 villages. And you'll watch over 30 days from the middle of January to the middle of February as they are literally erased from the planet. Now, here's the thing that's really powerful about these technologies. This analysis was concluded on about the 19th of February, and it was released on like the 22nd of February. And it was on the government's radar within 24 or 48 hours after that. And that's the kind of pressure that we are watching in real time. Not that you did this, but we're watching you doing this right now. Okay. It's not just in places like Myanmar. We're actually watching these enormous Uyghur detention camps. This is a facility, one of 39 that we found in China, where this ethnic minority is being re-educated, and there's a bunch of forced labor going on. The thing to say about that facility that you saw growing is it's about a 1.1 million square feet of livable space in one facility. And we can watch those things being grown. And just so that you think we're not just looking at other parts of the world, I want to show you this. This is the Tornillo Detention Center, the Tornillo Detention Facility in Texas, where refugee children are separated from their parents. Now, some of you who are connected to America might know we had a huge political kerfuffle about this and a big fight about it. And finally, the administration backed down and said, we're going to stop. Well, this is what it looked like when they said they were going to stop. This is what it looked like in the middle of September, 3 months after they said they were going to stop. And this is what our friends in the analysis department showed, all the growth, right, that showed they were continuing to implement this policy even after they said they were going to make the change. So there are tremendous opportunities to create accountability, pressure, action, and to really understand exactly what you're arguing about. Now, this is my last thought for you, okay? All of these technologies are very powerful. They hold enormous potential for the people in this room. But I'm a man of a certain age and a certain girth. And I happen to like this one folk singer that we have from the United States named Ani DeFranco. Do you know who Ani DeFranco is? Some of you will know who she is. She's a wonderful thought, and I think it's very relevant here. And she said, every tool is a weapon if you hold it right, including this one. And what does that mean? What do we really mean by that? Well, I'm going to give you an example. Let's think about who's ready to use these tools today. Well, companies, the private sector, we're like up there today. Substantially less ready to use them, thankfully, are governments, because we're still figuring out how to use them in the right kinds of ways. We want policy and the technology to catch up with each other. And advocates and actors, the people in this room, probably right now down there, I think. So let's just think about that as a wedge. Now that's today. What's going to happen as we hit those tipping points is this. The capacity of the companies is going to go way up there. The capacity of the governments is going to go way up there. And the advocates and actors, the people in this room, might go up by 60%. All of those represent a 60% increase in capacity. But what happens is the difference between the companies and the actors in this room increases if we just let things proceed. If we don't work with you very carefully right now to get you ready for this, what's going to happen is the inequality is going to grow. So we have to work together. Now, in order to do that, I want to just leave you these two thoughts about data. The first thing is, data is not just an extractive thing. People call it the new oil. It's not infallible. It will not always tell you the right answer. It will sometimes tell you confusing things about yourself and the world. It's not a silver bullet, and it's not the end of the story, right? Actually, it's the beginning of the story. It can be equity and fertilizer and the glue for collaboration between us, the thing that allows us to have a common view of the world around us. But the only way we're going to get there is if we actually work together. We keep hearing this over and over again. So I just want to share an intention with you. Our organization has looked at these big problems, and we figured out a model where if the philanthropists will put in some capital, we and others will put in the data, bring the academic and scientific community along, and create a new kinds of observatory. We just did this for coral reefs with the co-founder of Microsoft, Paul Allen, who just recently passed away. We launched something called the Allen Coral Atlas, in which we've mapped all the world's coral reefs in incredibly high-resolution detail. But we can do the same thing for trafficking and slavery today, together, all of us in this room, working together under a common framework, sorting out what works and what doesn't, moving from reactive to real-time to predictive analytics, and moving from private value in the data to public goods. The most important thing, though, is I think, especially in this era, to deal with that wedge, we got to deal with this one problem, which is this. We have to embrace what we call the many eyes hypothesis. The many eyes hypothesis is an hypothesis about why birds flock together. Why do animals come together in those giant swarms? And the reason is that when they're all together, they can look out in all directions, including at each other, to keep each other honest, right? They can see danger at the horizon. They're much stronger together than they are as individuals. With these technologies, we need governments looking at people, and people looking at governments, and journalists looking at governments, and companies looking at people, and all of these things around and around and around. We all need to be in the game together. And I think we can begin that. So anyway, I'm really excited about that idea. I'd love to see us have more conversations about it, and thank you.